I worked the swing shift at Three Rivers Bend on the night the calls started coming in, and I had been working that shift for almost 6 years by then, long enough that I knew the rhythms of the floor better than I knew the rhythms of my own kitchen at home. My name is Hollis Pewterman, and the people who knew me on the floor mostly called me Pewt, because Hollis sounded like a name from a bank statement, and the casino was not a bank. The casino sat on a low rise above the river about 20 miles out from the nearest town with a stoplight, in country that ran to scrub oak and grazing lease. The tribe that owned and operated it had been in that valley for longer than the road was paved, and they ran the property the way a careful family runs a long-held business. Tight on hiring, slow to fire, suspicious of consultants. I was not enrolled. Most of us in uniform security were not. The gaming commission staff, the surveillance leads, the executive floor. Those were tribal members, or close to it. The rest of us were locals who had passed the background check and the drug screen and a temperament interview that was longer than people expected. My shift started at 4 in the afternoon and ran to midnight, with the option to flex 2 hours either way if a supervisor needed me. On a Thursday in October, the floor would not have been full, but it would have been steady. The retiree buses from 3 counties over, the day trippers who came for the buffet, the regulars who sat at the same nickel slot and treated it like a porch. The hotel tower attached to the east end of the building was about 3/4 booked because of a softball tournament out at the county complex, which meant a lot of families with children eating at the steakhouse and a lot of polo shirts at the sports bar. I knew all of this before I clocked in, because the morning briefing email listed expected occupancy and any flagged trespass alerts, and any active investigations the surveillance team wanted floor security to be aware of. There were 2 trespasses listed and 1 self-exclusion follow-up, which was routine. I clocked in at the security office on the back of house side, which sat behind an unmarked door past the employee dining room. The office had a long counter with the radio chargers, a wall of lockers for batons and cuffs and flashlights, and a whiteboard that listed assignments by post. My post that night was floor 2, which covered the eastern half of the gaming floor, including the high-limit slot room and the entrance to the steakhouse. My partner on the radio for that quadrant was a woman named Eula Dressler, who had been there longer than I had and who treated the job with the kind of deadpan patience you only develop by watching grown men cry over a hand of pai gow. The shift supervisor was a man named Demery Kettle, mid-50s, prior MP. The kind of supervisor who would write you up for an untucked shirt and then buy you a coffee on his break to make sure you weren't sour about it. Above him in the chain that night was a gaming commission officer named Lauren Twohawks, who was not technically my supervisor, but who could overrule any of us if he saw something he didn't like. The briefing that afternoon was unremarkable. Demery read out the trespass list, reminded us that the high-limit room had a new dealer who was still on probationary supervision, and mentioned that the surveillance team had been seeing a slight uptick in chip pinching on the lower-stakes blackjack tables. He didn't say anything about the news. None of us did. There had been some stories that week about a contagious illness in 2 cities back east, and a memo had gone out from corporate communications saying that staff should not engage with guests on the topic and should refer questions to the front desk, which was a polite way of saying, refer them to no one. I had read the memo and forgotten it by the time I picked up my radio. My radio that night was Channel 3, which was the floor channel for our quadrant. Channel 1 was supervisor traffic, Channel 2 was surveillance, Channel 4 was the hotel and valet, and Channel 5 was the cage and the count room. We were not supposed to switch channels without telling someone, and most of us only carried 1 earpiece anyway, because 2 earpieces in a noisy floor environment made it impossible to hear a guest who was trying to ask you where the restroom was. I clipped my radio to my belt, ran a function check with Eula, and walked out onto the floor at 4:06. The gaming floor at Three Rivers Bend was laid out in a rough horseshoe around a central bar. The main entrance opened onto a wide carpeted aisle that led past the registration desk and the Players Club kiosk, and emptied into the slot bank, which formed the outer ring of the horseshoe. The table games sat in the inner ring, with the high-limit room walled off in glass at the eastern end, and the poker room walled off in glass at the western end. The cage, where chips were exchanged and large jackpots were paid out, sat at the back of the horseshoe, opposite the main entrance. Behind the cage was a short hallway that led to the count room, which I had only been inside twice in 6 years, and both times under escort. The hotel tower connected to the property by way of a long enclosed walkway off the western corridor, past the steakhouse and the conference rooms. The parking garage attached to the north side of the building, with covered self-park on 3 levels and a valet circle out front. There were 6 fire exits I knew of, all alarmed, all monitored from surveillance, and 2 service exits that opened onto the loading dock and the trash compactor pad, respectively. I walked the eastern half of the floor for the first hour without incident. I greeted the regulars by name where I knew them. I kept an eye on the high-limit room from the outside. I did a courtesy check at the entrance to the steakhouse to make sure the maitre d' wasn't dealing with anyone difficult. The first thing that I would later identify as out of the ordinary happened at 5:20, when a man at one of the dollar slots near the steakhouse called me over and asked if I could help him find his wife. He said she had gone to the restroom about an hour earlier and hadn't come back. He was a heavy man in his 60s, wearing a denim jacket with a patch from a roofing company on the chest, and he looked more confused than worried. I radioed Eula and asked her to do a courtesy page from the Players Club desk, which was a normal request. While we waited, I asked him a few questions: what she was wearing, whether she was on any medication, whether they had a meeting place agreed on, and he answered them in the patient, slightly embarrassed way that older men answer questions about their wives. The page went out twice over the floor speakers. She didn't come. I asked Demery on Channel 1 to send a female officer to do a restroom check on the Eastern Bank, which was protocol when a guest's spouse had gone missing for over 30 minutes. The officer who responded was a younger woman named Brissette Ouellette, who had been on the team about 8 months. Brissette went into the Eastern Bank restroom and came out about 2 minutes later and told me on Channel 3, in a voice that was a little too even, that I needed to come over to the corridor outside and bring Eula, and that I should ask Demery to come too. She didn't say why on the open channel, which was correct procedure. I called Demery on Channel 1 and told him we had a situation outside the Eastern restrooms. When I got there, Brissette was standing in the corridor with her back to the restroom door and her hand resting on her radio. She told me, quietly, that there was a woman inside who was not responding to questions, who appeared to be injured, and who had bitten another woman who had tried to help her. The woman who had been bitten was sitting on the carpet a few feet away from the restroom entrance with her hand wrapped in a wad of paper towels, and she was telling Brissette, and now me, that she just wanted to go home. The wound on her hand was deep enough that the paper towels were already saturated, and I could see a clear half-moon impression in the meat of her palm where teeth had closed. The woman was perhaps 40, dressed for a casual dinner, and she was crying in the controlled way of a person who is trying not to make a scene. Demery arrived inside of a minute. He looked at the bitten woman, looked at Brissette, looked at me, and called for the on-property paramedic on Channel 1. We had a contracted EMT on shift during the busy hours, a man named Vance Trowbridge, who worked out of a small first aid room near the back of the cashier area. While we waited for Vance, Demery told me to keep guests away from the corridor. I stepped a few feet down toward the floor and stood in a way that made the corridor look closed without making it look like a crime scene. People in casinos will accept a man in uniform standing in a hallway as a reason not to walk down it. as long as you don't make eye contact with them, and as long as you don't look frightened. I was not frightened yet. I was annoyed, the way you are annoyed when a shift starts going sideways at the end of the first hour, and you know the paperwork is going to keep you past midnight. Vance came down the corridor with his orange bag and went into the restroom with Brissette. The bitten woman was helped to her feet by Eula, who had walked over from her post, and was guided toward the first aid room. Demery stayed at the corridor entrance with me. He told me, in a low voice, that the woman in the restroom had not just bitten the other woman. She had tried to bite Brissette as well, and Brissette had needed to push the door closed against her. He said the woman in the restroom did not appear to be drunk or high in any way he recognized. He said she did not appear to be conscious in the normal sense. He said it the way a man says something that he has not yet allowed himself to think about. Vance came out of the restroom about 3 minutes later. He was pale. He told Demery, on Channel 1 and not on the open floor channel, that the woman inside was deceased, that she had been deceased for some time before the biting incident, and that he could not explain what he had just seen. He used the word deceased 3 times in 2 sentences, which was unlike him. Demery thanked him and told him to return to the first aid room and stay with the bitten woman until the ambulance from the county arrived. He had already called the ambulance. He had also, I learned a moment later, called Lauren Two Hawks at the Gaming Commission desk because anything involving a death on the property was a matter for the commission before it was a matter for anyone else. Lauren came down the corridor at about 5:40. He was a tall man, late 40s, calm in a way that read as either spiritual or military, depending on the day. He went into the restroom alone after telling Demery to keep the corridor closed, and he came out about 90 seconds later and told us that the door was now to remain closed, that no one was to enter, and that the county sheriff had been called. He said this with the same calm. He also said, and this is the part that I remember most clearly from that early stretch of the evening, that he had recognized the woman. He said her name was a name I will not repeat here, because I do not have her family's permission. But he said she had been at the property earlier in the day with her husband, and that he had personally walked her to the restroom around 3 o'clock, because she had told him she was not feeling well. 3 o'clock. That meant she had been in the restroom for over 2.5 hours before her husband, the man at the dollar slots in the denim jacket, had asked me about her. I stood in that corridor for the next 40 minutes. The county sheriff's deputies arrived at 6:15, which was faster than usual, but not as fast as it should have been. And Lauren met them at the main entrance and walked them back through the floor. While I was standing there, 3 more calls came in over Channel 2, which I could hear because Eula had switched her earpiece over and was relaying to me in person. The first call was from the surveillance room, which had been watching a man in the poker room behave erratically at a cash table, standing up, sitting down, staring at the dealer, sitting down again, for the better part of an hour. The second call was from a guest at the sports bar who had reported a fight. Except that when our officer Pel Mockery arrived, the fight had already ended and one of the participants was on the floor not breathing. The third call was from a housekeeper in the hotel tower who had opened a room on the 4th floor for a noise complaint and had then closed the room and locked it again and called her supervisor and was now in the housekeeping office crying. I do not want to give the impression that we understood in those first 90 minutes what was happening. We did not. What we understood was that we had 3 separate medical incidents on the property within an hour of each other, that one of them involved a deceased guest who had injured another guest, and that the county was sending more units. That kind of cluster does happen. Food poisoning will sometimes do it. A carbon monoxide leak will sometimes do it. Even a bad batch of something cut with fentanyl can do it. And the protocols for any of those things were familiar to us. What we did not have a protocol for was the thing Vance had seen in the restroom. And Vance was not a man who used the word deceased lightly. At 6:45, Demery called all uniformed security to the back hallway behind the cage for a quick standing briefing. There were 11 of us on shift that night, plus Demery, plus Lauren, plus the surveillance team upstairs who patched in by radio. Demery told us, plainly, that we had multiple incidents in progress, that the county was on property, that the Gaming Commission was assuming oversight, and that we were to follow surveillance's directions on patron movement. He told us not to discuss the incidents with guests. He told us not to use the word death on any open channel. He told us that the executive on call had been notified, and that the decision about whether to close the floor was being made at a level above ours. I will say here that I have thought about that briefing a great many times in the years since, and I do not blame Demery for any part of it. He gave us the information he had, and he gave us instructions that were consistent with the information he had. The thing none of us yet understood was that the information itself was already obsolete by the time he was speaking it. When I got back to my post on the eastern floor, I noticed that the noise level had changed. A casino floor has a sound to it that is partly machine and partly human, and the human part is what shifts when something is wrong. The slot machines were still ringing and chiming because they don't know anything is wrong, but the conversations between people had grown quieter and more clustered. 2 retirees at a video poker bank were watching the corridor outside the restrooms instead of their screens. A cocktail server passed me with a tray and didn't say hello, which she always did. The smell of the floor, that filtered, slightly perfumed air that casinos pay good money to maintain, had a thread of something unwashed running through it, faintly, the way a kitchen smells when a pot has been left on a burner 2 rooms away. At 7:02, a woman screamed in the high-limit slot room. I was about 30 feet from the glass wall of the high-limit room when it happened, and I saw the scream before I heard it. A woman in a sequined top stood up from her chair at one of the high-denomination machines and stepped backward into the aisle with her hand over her mouth. Through the glass, I could see what she was looking at. A man 2 seats down from her had slumped forward against his machine and was no longer moving. Standing over him, with one hand on the back of his chair, was another man. A man I recognized as the man from the poker room that surveillance had been watching for the past hour. And that man was, very deliberately, and without any apparent emotion, leaning down to put his face against the slumped man's neck. I keyed my radio and called the high-limit room on Channel 3. I did not run. I have been trained since my first month on the job not to run on the floor unless a child is in the immediate path of a vehicle. Because running creates panic, and panic creates stampede. And stampede creates more casualties than almost any single incident can. I walked at a fast, professional pace toward the glass door of the high-limit room. Eula was already coming from the other direction. The high-limit attendant, a woman named Ginevra Ostland, who had worked that room for as long as I had worked the property, was standing by her podium with one hand on the wall phone and the other on the panic button under the lip of the podium, which she had already pressed. The panic button under Ginevra's podium was wired to the surveillance room, not to the police. It was meant to summon additional security. It did. By the time I reached the glass door, 2 more officers were coming up the floor behind me, and a third had appeared from the direction of the steakhouse. The man standing over the slumped patron looked up at us through the glass, and his face was wrong in a way that I am going to describe carefully, because I do not want to indulge in the language that has since become common around these events. His face was wrong in the way that an unconscious person's face is wrong when their eyes are open. There was no expression on it. He was not snarling or grimacing. He was looking at us the way a dog looks at a closed refrigerator, with attention, but without anticipation. He did not move when we came through the door. He stayed where he was, with one hand on the chair, and he watched us approach. Eula and I had our batons out, which was unusual on the floor. We are trained to keep them on the belt unless a use of force situation has been declared. But Demery had keyed in over Channel 1 as we were approaching and had told us to draw and to maintain distance. The woman in the sequined top was still standing in the aisle. Ginevra had come around her podium and was guiding two other patrons toward the door, telling them in a calm voice that there was a maintenance issue and that we needed to clear the room for a few minutes. I want to be specific about what happened next, because I have heard people describe scenes like this with a great deal of action in them, and what happened in the high-limit room at Three Rivers Bend that night did not have action in it. It had decisions. The man at the chair did not lunge at us. He looked at me, and then he looked at Eula, and then he looked at the woman in the sequined top, and he chose her. He took two unhurried steps in her direction, and Eula and I closed the distance between us and him. And Eula struck him across the side of the knee with her baton, and I struck him across the upper arm, and he went down onto the carpet without making a sound. He did not cry out. He did not curse. He did not explain himself. He went down and then he tried to get up again, with his knee clearly broken, and he did not appear to register that his knee was broken. We restrained him with two sets of cuffs, one on each wrist, linked through the leg of a bolted slot machine. And we did this while he kept trying to reach forward with his teeth, and the entire time he made no sound except the sound of his own breathing. The slumped man at the machine was deceased. Ginevra confirmed it with two fingers at his throat. She had been a CNA before she took the high-limit job, which I did not know until that moment. She told me, in the same calm voice she had used with the patrons, that he had been deceased for at least several minutes, possibly longer, and that the wound on his neck was not consistent with anything she had seen in a clinical setting. I stayed in the high-limit room with Eula until Lauren and two deputies arrived. The woman in the sequined top had been guided out by Ginevra and was sitting at a chair near the cage with a glass of water. The cuffed man on the carpet was still trying to reach forward with his mouth. One of the deputies, a young man whose name tag read Brescott, looked at the cuffed man for a long time and then looked at his partner, an older deputy whose name I did not catch. And the older deputy keyed his shoulder mic and asked his dispatch to confirm what he had been told to do in this situation. The reply came back garbled, but the words, "Do not transport," were audible to all of us. The older deputy looked at Lauren. Lauren looked at Demery, who had just come through the door. Demery looked at me. That moment, the chain of looks, none of which contained an answer, is the moment that I now think of as the end of the first phase of the night, although I did not know it then. We were still operating inside a system. The system was beginning to fail to give us instructions, but we were still operating inside it, the way a man on a phone call still talks into the receiver after the call has dropped. The decision was made by Lauren. He told the deputies that the cuffed man would remain in the high-limit room, restrained, until further instruction came down from their dispatch. He told Demery to seal the high-limit room and post an officer at the glass door. He told me to return to the floor and assist with what he called patron flow management, which was the polite term for trying to get everyone out of the building without telling them why. The closure of the floor was announced at 7:28. The announcement came over the floor PA in the voice of the assistant general manager, a woman named Ardith Goose Smith, who had been asleep at home an hour earlier and who had clearly been briefed on the way in. She announced, in the tone that announcements at casinos always use, that due to a maintenance issue affecting the gaming systems, the floor would be closing for the evening at 8 o'clock, that all in-progress play would be honored, that the cage would remain open for chip redemption until 9, and that the hotel and the steakhouse and the sports bar would remain in normal operation. She did not say the word evacuate. She did not say the word Emergency. She thanked the guests for their patience and reminded them that complimentary coffee was available at the Players Club desk. People did not panic. That is the part I want to emphasize. People in casinos are conditioned to small inconveniences. A machine going down, a table closing, a card reader failing. And the announcement was framed as a slightly larger version of those inconveniences. Most patrons stood up from their machines, cashed out their tickets, and began the long, unhurried walk toward the cage. Some grumbled. Most did not. The flow was the flow of a Thursday night at closing time, except an hour early. I stood at my post on the eastern floor and directed people toward the cage and toward the main entrance and toward the parking garage exit. And I answered questions about the maintenance issue with the line we had been given at the briefing, that it was an electrical concern affecting the gaming systems and that the property would reopen tomorrow. By 7:50, the floor was perhaps two-thirds emptied. By 8:05, it was nearly clear, with a residual cluster of patrons still in line at the cage. The high-limit room remained sealed. The eastern restroom corridor remained sealed. The poker room had been quietly cleared by surveillance during the announcement, on the grounds that the man surveillance had been watching had left the table sometime before he ended up in the high-limit room, and they wanted to confirm no one else from that table required attention. They did, in fact, find a woman in the poker room restroom who was in the same condition as the woman in the eastern restroom. That news was passed to Demery on Channel 1 and not over the open channels. I was at the cage line at 8:14, helping an elderly man count his ticket vouchers when the first power flicker happened. The lights in the cage area dipped for perhaps half a second and then came back. The slot machines reset themselves with their familiar boot-up chimes, which were unsettling in the half-emptied floor because the chimes were normally lost in the noise. The cage cashier, a woman named Penrith Vall, who I had worked with for years, looked up at me with an expression I had never seen her wear before. The cage had its own backup power, which she knew, and the slot floor was on a separate circuit, also backup supported, which she also knew. A flicker that affected both circuits at once was not a normal flicker. The second flicker came at 8:16. This time the lights stayed dim for perhaps 3 seconds and the slot machines did not all come back at once. About a quarter of them remained dark. The cage lights stayed up because the cage was on yet a third circuit. Penrith picked up her phone to call the count room and put it down again because the line was dead. I keyed my radio on Channel 3 and got nothing but static. I switched to Channel 1 and got Demery, faintly, telling someone, I could not tell who, to hold position. The third event was not a flicker. At 8:19, the main floor lights went out and stayed out, and the emergency lights came up. The emergency lights at Three Rivers Bend were not the dim, red-tinted things you see in older buildings. They were bright white LED panels mounted at the corners of every section, and they cast a flat, institutional light that made the carpet look gray and the slot machines look like furniture. About half the slot machines were now dark. The PA system was dead. The cage backup power was still up. The hotel tower, I would learn later, had stayed on its own generator and never lost power at all. I have spent a long time thinking about what I did in the next 10 minutes, and I am not going to romanticize it. I helped Penrith and the other 2 cage cashiers finish the line of patrons who were still waiting, because that was what I had been told to do, and because the alternative was to leave them standing there. The line moved faster once the flickers stopped, partly because Penrith stopped asking for ID on small redemptions, which was a violation of policy that no one in management would later mention. The last patron at the cage was a woman with a walker who had won $112 at the nickel slots. Penrith counted out her cash in 20s and 10s and a 5, and the woman thanked her, and Eula walked her out to the main entrance. That was at 8:32. At 8:33, on Channel 1, Demery called all uniformed security to the back hallway behind the cage. He used the word all, which he never used, because some of us were always supposed to be on the floor. There were 9 of us in the back hallway when he started talking. Brissette was at the first aid room with Vance and the bitten woman, and Pell was still at the sports bar with the man on the floor who had stopped breathing. Demery told us, plainly, that the situation had escalated beyond what the property could manage with on-shift staff. He told us that the county had advised, by phone before the lines went dead, that they could not send additional units because they were dealing with similar incidents at 3 other locations within the county. He told us that the tribal police, who had jurisdiction on the property, had 2 officers on site already and a 3rd en route. He told us that the assistant general manager had ordered a full evacuation of the floor staff, of the hotel staff, and of any remaining patrons in the hotel tower, with the assembly point being the parking garage. He told us, last, that the man cuffed to the slot machine in the high-limit room was no longer the only person in that condition on the property. There were now, by surveillance's count from the upstairs cameras before the main system had gone dark, at least 4 others. 2 were in the hotel tower. 1 was in the back-of-house kitchen. 1 was somewhere in the parking garage, which surveillance had only seen briefly on a camera that had gone dark before they could get a clean angle. A man in the parking garage, where the assembly point was. I want to describe Demery's face when he said that, because it is the only time in 6 years I saw him look uncertain. He was not afraid. He was uncertain. He was a man who had been given a set of orders that contained an internal contradiction, and he was the man who had to decide which order to follow. He chose, in the end, to follow the assistant general manager's order, because she was the senior person on the property, and because the parking garage was the only assembly point large enough to hold the staff and remaining patrons. But he modified the order. He told 2 officers, Eula and a man named Grenick Vale, who had a background as a corrections officer, to clear the parking garage before the evacuation began. He told 2 more officers to clear the hotel tower, floor by floor, in coordination with the housekeeping supervisor. He told the rest of us, including me, to escort the remaining staff and patrons from the floor and the back of house to the parking garage in a controlled flow. He told us to use the western corridor, past the steakhouse and the conference rooms, because the main entrance was closer to the high-limit room, and he did not want anyone walking past that glass wall. The clearing of the parking garage took 23 minutes, which I know because I looked at my watch when Eula came back over Channel 1 and reported it clear. What she actually reported was that they had located 1 individual on the 2nd level of the garage, in the condition we were now all carefully not naming, and that they had been able to restrain him inside an unoccupied vehicle by the simple method of opening the door of an empty SUV, allowing him to follow Grenick into it, and closing the door behind him. The SUV was locked. The owner of the SUV would be contacted later, Eula said with the dryness that I had come to depend on from her, at a more convenient time. The hotel clearing took longer and was less clean. Of the 2 individuals surveillance had identified in the tower, 1 was found in a guest room on the 4th floor in a condition consistent with the woman from the eastern restroom. That is, deceased and not moving, but with eyes open. The officers who entered the room closed it again and locked it from the outside with the housekeeping master, which they had been issued for the evacuation, and they marked the door with a strip of red tape from a maintenance kit. The 2nd individual was found in a stairwell between the 7th and 8th floors and was not restrainable by the methods we had available. He had been a guest, a man in his 30s, and he was in the stairwell with a woman who appeared to be his wife and who was not in the same condition, but who was sitting on the steps holding her arm where he had bitten her. The officers who found them, a man named Tarbet Isles and a woman named June Qualley, made a decision in that stairwell that I will describe as it was described to me, because I was not there. Tarbet kept the man at distance with his baton, while June helped the woman down the stairs to the lobby. The man followed them down the stairs. At the bottom of the stairwell, on the ground floor, Tarbet opened the stairwell door, allowed the man to step out into the small antechamber that connected the stairwell to the laundry room, and then closed the stairwell door from the inside, leaving the man in the antechamber. The antechamber was a dead end with a locked exterior service door. The man was, for the purposes of the evacuation, contained. The woman who had been bitten was brought to the parking garage assembly point with the rest of the evacuated guests. She was alert and lucid. She was crying. The evacuation completed at 9:06. There were, by a count Demery and Lauren did together at the assembly point, 231 people gathered on the second and third levels of the parking garage. Staff, remaining patrons, and the 2 tribal police officers who had been on site. There had been, before the evacuation, perhaps 320 people on the property, which meant that close to 90 people were not accounted for. Some of those would later turn out to have left the property earlier in the evening without being registered as leaving. Patrons who had not come through the cage, hotel guests who had checked out at the kiosk. Others would not. The decision in the parking garage was the decision that I think about most often, and it was not made cleanly. Ardith Goose Smith, the assistant general manager, wanted the assembled group to wait in the garage for the county to send transport. Lauren Two Hawks, the gaming commission officer, wanted the group to disperse to private vehicles and leave the property under their own power. Demery wanted to consolidate the group inside the hotel tower, which had its own generator and its own water supply, and which had been mostly cleared. The 2 tribal police officers, whose names were Casson Birdwell and Olin Three Crows, wanted to wait for direction from their lieutenant, who had not answered his radio in 20 minutes. The argument lasted perhaps 9 minutes. It was conducted in low voices at the front of the assembled group, near the ramp down to the first level, while the rest of us, uniformed security, dealers, cocktail servers, kitchen staff, maintenance, a few hotel guests in pajamas, stood in clusters and tried not to listen. I was standing near a column on the second level with Eula and a dealer named Quintus Heffernan, who had worked the high-limit room earlier in the evening and who had been one of the first people to notice the man from the poker room behaving strangely. Quintus was a quiet man in his 50s, who had been a dealer at 3 different properties over 30 years, and he had the air of a man who had been through evacuations before, although for different reasons. Quintus was the one who said, quietly, that the argument at the front of the group was the wrong argument. He said the right question was not where to wait, but how long the parking garage was viable as a position. He pointed out that the garage had 3 vehicle entrances, all of which were open to the exterior. He pointed out that the pedestrian door from the garage into the casino had been propped open with a fire extinguisher during the evacuation and had not yet been closed. He pointed out that the garage's emergency lights were on the same circuit as the floors, and that we did not know how long that circuit would hold. Eula keyed channel 1 and asked Demery to come over. Demery came. Quintus repeated his observations to Demery in the same quiet voice. Demery listened. Demery had the kind of face that did not betray what he was thinking, but he listened, and when Quintus was done, Demery said, "You're right." He said it without ego. Then he went back to the front of the group and told Ardith and Lauren and the 2 tribal officers that he was going to start moving people into the hotel tower, and that they could continue their discussion while he did it. Lauren backed him. That was the moment that mattered. Lauren had the authority on tribal property to overrule the assistant general manager on a safety question, and he chose to back Demery's call. Ardith did not fight it. She was, I think, tired, and she was, I think, glad to have someone else make the decision. The move from the parking garage to the hotel tower took 35 minutes and went through the western corridor, the same route we had used for the evacuation, in reverse. We did it in groups of about 30, with 2 officers at the front of each group and 1 at the back. The hotel lobby had been cleared by the floor-by-floor team during the evacuation, and the elevators were working on the hotel's independent generator. We placed people in the second-floor conference rooms, which were the largest enclosed spaces in the tower, and we placed the bitten woman from the stairwell in a guest room on the 3rd floor with Vance, the EMT, because Vance had asked to be the one to attend her. I was in the 3rd floor hallway outside that guest room at 10:42 when the bitten woman died. I know the time because Vance came out of the room and told Demery on Channel 1, and I checked my watch as a reflex. Vance said she had stopped breathing about 4 minutes earlier and that he had not been able to revive her. He said she had been speaking coherently up until perhaps 2 minutes before she stopped, and that her last clearly understood words had been to ask whether her daughter, who was at home with her mother, would be told that she had died at the casino, or whether they would say she had died on the way home. Vance said he had told her that he didn't know, but that whoever told the daughter would tell her gently. He said this in the corridor with his hand on the doorframe of the guest room, and then he went back inside, because the next thing he had to do was sit with the body and decide what to do about it before it did the thing that the others had done. The decision Vance made was to wait until Demery came up. Demery came up within 5 minutes. The 2 of them were in the room together for perhaps 3 minutes, and then Demery came out and told me to find Lauren and ask him to come up. I went down to the 2nd floor and found Lauren in the larger of the 2 conference rooms, and I told him what Demery had asked, and Lauren went up. I did not go back up with him. I stayed on the 2nd floor at Demery's instruction and helped Eula and the housekeeping supervisor, a woman named Estrid Marrowbone, who had been calm to a degree that I now recognize as professional and not personal, distribute bottled water from the housekeeping carts to the people in the conference rooms. What happened in that guest room on the 3rd floor I did not see, and I will not pretend to. What I know is that Lauren and Demery and Vance came down to the 2nd floor about 20 minutes later, and that Vance was crying quietly, and that Demery's hand was bandaged. The bandage was clean, and the hand looked unbroken, but there was a small spot of blood on the bandage. Demery did not explain. He did not explain to me or to anyone else what had happened in that room, although I think Eula knew, and I think Estrid knew, and I think any of us with a half hour to think about it knew. At 11:11, Demery told me to come with him to the security office on the back of house side, which had not been used since the evacuation. We walked down through the western corridor, past the dark steakhouse, past the dark conference rooms on the 1st floor, through the unmarked door into the back of house, and into the security office. He sat down at the desk where he normally did his paperwork, and he took off his bandage and looked at his hand. And the wound on his hand was a half-moon impression in the meat of the palm, the same shape as the wound I had seen on the woman in the eastern restroom corridor 4 hours earlier. He told me then that he was going to remain in the security office for the rest of the night. He told me that he was going to lock the door from the inside and that he was going to give me his keys and his radio. He told me that I was to take over coordination of the group in the hotel tower with Eula and Lauren until either the county arrived or the tribal lieutenant established contact. He told me that if he did not respond to a knock on the door at any point during the night, I was not to open the door under any circumstances. He told me this in the same flat, professional voice he had used for 6 years of shift briefings, and I sat across from him and listened, and I did not argue, because there was nothing to argue about. He gave me his keys and his radio. He told me which key opened the surveillance room upstairs, which key opened the count room, which key opened the cage's secondary door. He told me that the master key on the ring was a tribal master, and that I was not to use it without Lauren's say-so. He told me, last, that he had 3 daughters, and that 2 of them lived out of state, and that his wife's name was Marielle, and that her cell number was written on a card in his wallet, which he placed on the desk between us. He told me that if anyone ever found his wallet, I should make sure she got the card. I left the security office at 11:24. I heard the lock turn behind me. I walked back through the western corridor to the hotel tower with his keys in my pocket and his radio on my belt, and I went up to the second-floor conference room, and I told Eula, and only Eula, what had happened. She did not ask any questions. She nodded once, and she put her hand on my arm for perhaps 2 seconds, and then she went back to handing out bottled water. I did not tell Lauren that night. I told him the next morning. I have thought about that decision, and I do not believe it was the right one. But it was the one I made, and Lauren has since told me that he understood why I made it. The night after that was not quiet, but it was not chaotic either. We had 231 people in the conference rooms and the lobby of the hotel tower, on the hotel's independent generator, with bottled water and with the contents of the steakhouse's walk-in cooler and the buffet's dry storage, which Estrid and the kitchen lead, a man named Powlett Cressing, had been organizing into meals since the evacuation began. We had 2 tribal police officers and 7 uniformed security officers, plus Vance the EMT and Ginevra the high limit attendant who had been a CNA. We had a generator that the hotel's chief engineer told us had about 30 hours of fuel at the current load. We had no working external phone line, but Lauren had a satellite phone that he had retrieved from the Gaming Commission office on the executive floor. And that phone had a working signal, and at 1 a.m, he was able to reach the tribal council chairman, who was at the chairman's home about 40 minutes away, and who was attempting to coordinate a regional response with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and with the state. At 3 a.m, the chairman called back on the satellite phone and told Lauren that a National Guard unit had been mobilized out of the armory at the county seat and that it would arrive at the property between 6 and 8 a.m, and that the unit had instructions to assist with evacuation to a regional staging area at the fairgrounds. He also told Lauren, and Lauren told the rest of us, that the situation was not contained to our county or our state, and that the chairman could not tell us how widespread it was because the chairman did not know. At 4 a.m, Eula came to me in the second-floor hallway and told me that she had heard a knock at the security office door downstairs about 10 minutes earlier, and that she had not opened the door, and that the knock had not repeated. I went down to the back of house with her, and we stood outside the security office for a long time, and there was no sound from inside. I did not open the door. I had been told not to. At 5:15, I went up to the surveillance room, which I had not been in since the lights went out, with one of the surveillance technicians, a man named Birch Olafson, who had been on shift in surveillance when the first incident happened. The surveillance room was on its own UPS and had limited camera feeds back, mostly the hotel cameras and a few of the back-of-house cameras that ran on a separate circuit. We could see, on the hotel cameras, what we had inside our position. We could see, on one of the back-of-house cameras, the corridor outside the security office, which was empty. We could not see most of the gaming floor. The cameras on the gaming floor were dark. What we could see, on a single camera that covered the loading dock at the rear of the property, was something I had not expected. There were 3 figures on the loading dock, moving slowly, and they were not in any uniform. They were people who had come from outside. Birch zoomed the camera as best he could, and we watched them for a few minutes. They moved like the ones inside. They did not look at each other. They moved toward the dock door, which was closed and locked, and then they moved away from it again, and then back, in a pattern that suggested they had come from somewhere and were now, for lack of any other instruction, simply present. I went back down to the second floor, and I told Lauren about the loading dock. Lauren told the chairman on the satellite phone. The chairman told Lauren that the National Guard unit had been delayed and would now arrive between 8 and 10 in the morning, and that Lauren should plan accordingly. The plan we made in the second-floor conference room at 5:40 in the morning, with Lauren and Eula and the two tribal officers, and Estrid and Powlett and Vance and me, was a plan that I am going to describe in detail, because the plan is the part of this that I am still proud of, even now, because the plan worked. The plan was this. The hotel tower had its own emergency exit at the rear of the lobby, which opened onto the small employee parking lot at the back of the property, separate from the main parking garage. The employee lot had a single vehicle gate that opened onto a service road that connected to the county highway about 3/4 of a mile away. The service road was outside the line of sight of the loading dock. The hotel's chief engineer, a man named Harville Stenchcombe, had confirmed that the gate could be opened manually with a release lever on the gatehouse. We had, in the employee lot, the vehicles of approximately 40 staff members, including a property shuttle bus that seated 28 and the kitchen's delivery van that seated 3 in the cab and could carry standing passengers in the cargo area. We had, additionally, the keys to 4 other property vehicles in the security office. Demery had given me those keys. The plan was to evacuate the 231 people in the hotel tower to the employee parking lot in 3 waves, beginning at 6 in the morning, using the rear emergency exit and avoiding the main parking garage and the loading dock. The first wave would be the staff with vehicles in the lot, who would drive their own cars to a designated rally point at a county park about 4 miles away. The second wave would be the patrons and staff who could fit in the shuttle bus. The third wave would be everyone else, in the delivery van and in the property vehicles and in any staff cars that had room. The rally point at the county park had been chosen by Lauren on the chairman's recommendation because the park had a large open field that could serve as a landing zone for the National Guard unit if the unit was diverted there. The evacuation began at 6:03 in the morning. It took until 7:11 to complete. The first wave of staff vehicles left the property in a quiet line that did not attract attention from the loading dock side of the building. The second wave, the shuttle bus, was driven by a maintenance worker named Onslow Drybeck, who had a CDL and who had been calm throughout the night. The third wave, which I was on, was the last one to leave, in the delivery van and the property vehicles, with Lauren in the lead vehicle and Eula in the rear, and with the 2 tribal police officers split between the front and the back. I was driving one of the property vehicles, an older Suburban that the property used for executive transport. In the back of the Suburban with me were 6 people: Vance, Estrid, Ginevra, Brizette, Powlett, and a hotel guest named Iverly Marston, who had been with us in the conference room since the evacuation, and who had spent most of the night helping Estrid with the water distribution. As I drove down the service road toward the county highway, I did not look back at the property. I have been asked many times why I did not look back, and the answer is that I have been told by Demery not to, and I was still, in some part of myself, following his instructions. The rally point at the county park was empty when we arrived. It remained empty for 45 minutes. The National Guard unit arrived at 8:06 in the morning, in 2 armored vehicles and 4 troop transports, with a major in command whose name was Toulemond Breeze, and who was professional and direct. He confirmed the chairman's plan, took an accurate count of our group, and arranged for transport to the regional staging area at the fairgrounds. He also confirmed, in answer to a direct question from Lauren, that the situation was widespread, that it was being treated as a public health emergency at the federal level, and that he could not yet tell us what would happen to the casino property, or to the people who had been left inside it. 2 of the people who had been left inside it were Demery Kettle, in the locked security office, and the bitten woman from the stairwell, in the guest room on the 3rd floor. There were others. We had not, in our final accounting, located everyone. Some of the missing had likely left the property earlier in the evening. Some had not. We did not know which were which. At the fairgrounds, in the early afternoon, I sat on a folding chair outside one of the intake tents with Eula, and we did not say very much to each other for about an hour. She was the one who eventually said that we had done what we had been trained to do, which was true, and that we had also done some things we had not been trained to do, which was also true. She said that the difference between the two was going to be the thing we thought about for a long time. I have thought about it. I have thought often about Demery in the security office, and about whether the choice he made was a choice or a discharge of a duty he no longer felt he could leave to anyone else. I have thought about Vance in the third-floor guest room, and about what he said to that woman before she stopped breathing. I have thought about Quintus Heffernan at the column in the parking garage, who saw what the rest of us were not yet seeing because we were too close to the argument at the front of the group. I have thought about Lauren Two Hawks, who did not, at any point that night, raise his voice, and who held the property together by the simple and exhausting method of being the calmest person in every room he walked into. I have thought, last, about the 231 people we evacuated, and about the fact that we got them to the rally point and then to the fairgrounds, and about the fact that this is the entire claim I will ever make about that night. We did not save the casino. We did not save the people who were already in the condition by the time we found them. We did not save Demery. We took 231 people from a position that was failing, and we moved them, in 3 waves, to a position that was not failing yet, and we did it without losing any of them in the move. That is the entire thing that I did at Three Rivers Bend on that night, and I have not had any other job since that has asked anything as specific of me, and I do not expect that I will. I went back to the property once, about 11 months later, with a tribal council escort and with Lauren and with a small federal team, when the property was being formally surveyed for what would eventually be its demolition. The security office door was open. The room had been entered at some point in the intervening months by people I did not know. Demery's wallet was not on the desk. I asked the tribal council member with us, a woman named Idessa Stanzalone, whether anyone had contacted Demery's wife in the days after the evacuation. She told me that Lauren had, on the satellite phone from the fairgrounds on the morning of the second day. She told me that Marielle Kettle had asked, on that call, whether her husband had been alone at the end, and that Lauren had told her that he had been doing his job, which was the answer Lauren had judged to be both true and useful. She told me that Marielle had thanked him and had not asked any other questions. I do not work in casino security anymore. I do not work in security at all. I work, now, in a small maintenance role at a community college about 90 miles from the property, and I live in a rented house with a yard that I have been slowly turning into a vegetable garden. I do not have any larger meaning to offer about what happened that night, and I am suspicious of anyone who claims to. What I have, instead, is a clear memory of a chain of decisions made by a small number of people under bad conditions, and a clear understanding that those decisions, taken together, were the reason that 231 people who were inside that building at 8 in the evening were inside a different building at 8 the next morning. That is the only sentence I trust myself to say about it without adding something untrue. The radio I carried that night, Demery's radio, is in a drawer in my kitchen. The battery has been dead for years. I do not charge it. I have not thrown it away. I do not know why I have not thrown it away, and I do not, anymore, ask myself.